There's a widespread impression fostered by people like the late Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins that science has shown that God is a delusion, so that no intellectually respectable person can possibly believe in him. Now, that cannot be true. Think of the Nobel Prize for Physics. Not long ago, it was won by a Scotsman, Peter Higgs. He's an atheist. Some years earlier, the very same prize was won by an American, Bill Phillips, who's a Christian. Now, clearly what divides these two men is not their physics. They've each won the Nobel Prize, and you can't go higher than that. What divides them, though, is their worldview. Higgs, an atheist, and Phillips, a Christian. And what is clear is that Phillips sees no conflict between science and his faith in God. Nor do I, among many others. Yet there's clearly a real conflict between the worldviews of atheism and theism. Atheism holds that this universe, multiverse for some, is all that exists. Mass energy, therefore, is the fundamental stuff, and there's nothing else. Theism, by contrast, holds that there is something else, that there is a God who originally created and continues to uphold the universe and is guiding it towards its goal. The question we therefore need to ask is this: does science support atheism, or does it support theism, or neither? Now, the only way I know how to answer a question like this is to look at evidence. Please note that I use the word evidence and not proof. For the word proof has at least two meanings. Firstly, proof in the rigorous mathematical sense, and that only occurs in my field of pure mathematics. In every other area of science, and indeed everyday life, you can talk about proof in an informal sense, meaning strong evidence or indicators of truth that put the matter beyond reasonable doubt. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that we cannot have sufficient certainty to stake our lives on something, even though we don't have rigorous mathematical or logical proof for it. For instance, I cannot prove to you mathematically that the woman who's been my wife for 55 years loves me, but I'd stake my life on it because I see plenty of evidence to believe that it's true. There are many things in life like that. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that the aircraft I recently flew on would arrive safely, but I staked my life on it. We must never make the mistake of thinking that because we can only speak of evidence, we can't have evidence strong enough on which to base firm conclusions. So in this talk, I'm going to present evidence to defend my deep conviction that God and science mix very well. That evidence will come from the history of science, the limits of science, the nature of explanation, and the nature of and grounds for faith, both in science and in God. So let's take history first. Modern science arose in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, all of them believers in God. Most historians and philosophers of science believe that there's a strong connection between Christianity and the rise of modern science. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature." And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. This is one of the reasons why I'm not ashamed to be a scientist and a Christian, because arguably, it was Christianity that gave me my subject. Isaac Newton believed in God, yet the late Stephen Hawking, a successor to Isaac Newton in his chair at Cambridge, did not. Hawking insisted that we must choose between science and God. Newton did not. What happened to cause this complete reversal? Well, I wish to suggest that it's a series of misunderstandings that have generated widespread confusion, indeed an intellectual fog. The first one is this, that statements of scientists are not necessarily statements of science. An illustration of this is when Stephen Hawking was asked by one of our national newspapers for his opinion about religion. Oh, he said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. Now, that is not a statement of science. It's a statement of his own atheistic belief. And I was asked to comment on this. So I said, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, that's not a statement of science either. It's a statement by a scientist, me, of my Christian belief. So we need to be critical and ask what evidence we have to support such things. What we say is not necessarily true simply because we are scientists and we say so. Nobel laureate Richard Feynman once said that outside of science, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. An example of this is the kind of wild assertion that belief in God is the same as belief in the tooth fairy. When this was once put to me in a debate by a physicist, I asked the audience to put up their hands if they had come to believe the tooth fairy as adults. No one put up their hand. Yet hundreds put up their hands when I asked how many of them had come to believe in God as adults. So it's really not very clever to put God in the same category as the tooth fairy. After all, many of the brightest people in the world have been arguing the case for the existence of God for centuries. They have certainly not been doing the same for the tooth fairy, because the tooth fairy doesn't exist. Now that brings me to a more serious confusion, that science is the only way to truth. That is a view we call scientism or scientific fundamentalism. We find it in Hawking and Mlodinoff's book, The Grand Design, where they roundly claim that philosophy is dead and that it's now left to scientists to bear the torch of truth in our generation. Well, it's rather silly to say that philosophy is dead in a book principally devoted to the philosophy of science. In fact, the statement that science is the only way to truth is strictly illogical, for it is not a statement of science, but a statement about science. Hence, if it is true that science is the only way to truth, then the statement that science is the only way to truth is false, which is self-contradictory. Scientism also dangerously confuses science with rationality, as if the two were the same. Yet, a moment's thought shows us that history, literature, philosophy, theology, art, music are all rational disciplines. And if science were the only way to truth, half the faculties in our universities would have to close overnight. Nobel laureate Sir Peter Medawar pointed out that the claim that science is the only way to truth is unworthy of science itself. He said that the existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Science deals with the what and the how, but it is easy to see that science cannot deal with the why of purpose. Why is the kettle boiling? Let's think about it. Well, you say it's boiling because heat energy from a gas flame is being conducted through the bottom of the copper kettle and is agitating the molecules of water, making them move faster and faster and faster, and the kettle is beginning to whistle. No, that's how it is boiling. Why it's boiling is because I want a cup of tea. Now, this simple illustration shows us that there are two different kinds of explanation of the kettle boiling. The scientific one, in terms of the physics of heat, and then what we might call the agent or personal explanation, the purpose for the boiling water, making a cup of tea. Hence, the nature of the agent explanation is very different from the nature of the scientific explanation. Now, let me apply this at a higher level by saying that God no more competes with science as an explanation for the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. What we have here is a scientific explanation in terms of law and mechanism, and an agent explanation, Henry Ford. They're different kinds of explanation belonging to different categories. Now, please note they do not conflict or compete. They complement one another. And what frankly amazes me that many young people like yourselves can see this instantly. Yet some of our best brains do not seem to be able to grasp that having scientific explanations about the universe is not an argument against the existence of an intelligent creator who designed the universe to work that way. There's real confusion about the nature of explanation. Now, please notice also that Henry Ford does not fill a gap in the scientific argument, in the sense that we don't understand how a car engine works, so we postulate the existence of Henry Ford to explain it. I say that because I'm often accused of believing in a so-called God of the gaps. Frankly, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. This is the kind of God the ancient Greeks believed in, like the god of lightning. They didn't understand lightning, so they postulated a god of lightning. However, modern science tells us what is really happening and shows no god of lightning is needed. Many people today think that that is what the God in whom I believe is like, yet it is entirely false. You see, those ancient Greek gods of the gaps were produced by the primeval chaotic earth and heavens, whereas the God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. He was not produced by it. He is in a completely different category. This helps us understand why many atheists tell us that we have to choose between God and science, because they've defined God to be that which science has not yet explained. So, if that's the case, of course we've got to choose between the two. But it's a false choice, because their idea of God is false. The God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. He created the things that we do understand and all that we don't. And for that reason, Isaac Newton, when he discovered his law of gravitation, didn't say, oh, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. I have filled what was a gap in our knowledge with a scientific explanation. He didn't do that. What he did do was to write the most famous book of the history of science called Principia Mathematica, in the hope, as he expressed it, that it would persuade a thinking person to believe in a deity. You see, it was what Newton understood of the universe that convinced him of the existence of God, not what he did not yet understand. And isn't that common experience, that the more you understand of something, the more you can admire the genius behind it? The more you understand painting, the more you can admire the brilliance of Rembrandt, not less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of Rolls and Royce, who designed it. And the more Newton saw of the glory of God in the universe he understood, the more he admired the genius of the God who'd done it that way. What does it mean to say that science explains? When I learned the law of gravity at school, and later on, I was able to derive the elliptical orbits of the planets from Newton's calculations, which was very exciting. But in those early days, I didn't quite realize that the law of gravitation doesn't tell you what gravity is. Nobody actually knows what gravity really is. If you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant physicists of all time. Nobody knows what it really is. The philosopher Wittgenstein once put his finger on it by saying that the greatest deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not. They are just descriptions. The law of gravity doesn't take you a whit further forward in understanding what gravity is. It gives you brilliant calculations to land people on the moon, but we don't know what gravity is from that law. So even at the first level, a scientific explanation in the form of a law is rarely, if ever, complete on its own terms without going outside of science. At this point, Richard Dawkins objects, as he does in his book, The God Delusion, claiming that postulating God as creator doesn't make sense, because you then have to face the question of who created this creator God. And then, logically, he thinks, who created the God who created the God who, and the questions go on forever, and concludes that therefore this is nonsense and so God doesn't exist. Now, to my utter amazement, when I first read this, I got the impression he thought this was a key argument that shows that God doesn't exist. And this is very confused thinking. For if you ask who created God, you are clearly assuming that God was created. But what if he wasn't? Then the question doesn't apply. And it doesn't. The claim of the Bible is that God isn't created like one of the Greek gods. He is eternal. He never came to be. I don't need Richard Dawkins to tell me that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols anyway. However, when I discussed this in my debate with him, as you can see on YouTube, I couldn't resist asking him his own question. I said, "You believe that the universe created you. So I ask you your own question. Who created your creator?" I never got an answer, and I've been waiting a long time. Now, the final confusion I wish to talk about is about the nature of faith itself. Many atheists subscribe to the idea that faith is a religious word that means believing where there's no evidence. And they then make ludicrous statements like, "Atheists have no faith," in books in which they tell us in great detail what they believe. That is, they tell us about their faith. You see, believing where there's no evidence is not faith, but blind faith. The word faith in English comes from fides in Latin, which means trust and loyalty. And we all know that it's unwise to have faith, believe in claims or people, if we have no grounds for so doing. It's very important, and other faiths and religious convictions must speak for themselves here, for us to realize that the Christian faith is evidence-based. Near the end of his gospel, John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing in him you might have life in his name. My faith in Christ is evidence-based. However, because of their erroneous definition of faith as blind faith, many scientists fail to appreciate that faith is also essential in science. No less than Einstein said that he couldn't imagine a genuine scientist without faith. Now, he didn't mean a faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. You see, isn't it obvious that in order to do science, you must believe that science can be done? You must believe that the human mind is capable of understanding nature, at least in part. Now, if I didn't share that faith, I wouldn't be a scientist. My argument so far is that faith in God is perfectly compatible with my faith in science. However, I will now make what I hope is a claim that will provoke you to think hard. Faith in atheism is not compatible with faith in science. In other words, science and atheism do not make comfortable bedfellows. In one of his letters, Charles Darwin wrote this: "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." Philosopher Alvin Plantinga updates this to the following: "If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore, inevitably, to doubt the validity of any belief they produce, including Dawkins' own science and atheism." Now listen to this. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Plantinga is one of the world's leading philosophers, and he's a Christian. But there are atheists now pointing out the very same thing. Atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel of New York writes, "If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism depends. And evolutionary naturalism is demanded by atheism. An increasing number of philosophers and thinkers are beginning to see that Darwin's doubt is as valid today as when he uttered it. I've asked many scientists, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it tomorrow as you go into your laboratory? I've always received the answer, no, I would not. Yet, the atheist scientist is asking me to do that with my mind. You see, my biggest difficulty with the atheist worldview is not that I'm a Christian, it's that I'm a scientist. And I'm simply not impressed with a worldview that doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot, but shoots itself in the brain. So my conclusion from all of that is that the history of science, the nature and limits of science, the nature of explanation, and the nature of and grounds for faith in both science and God provide powerful evidence that God and science mix very well. But, contrary to widespread belief, atheism and science do not mix well at all.
Hey guys, how are we doing? My name's Nadia and I'm part of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and we just want to say thank you for watching our video. At OCCA, we love to look into the big questions facing our time and our culture to see how the Christian faith gives answers that are both rational and rich in their understanding. If you enjoyed this video and you want to come along with us, then why not check out the rest of the content on this channel? Please consider subscribing and following as well, so that we can keep on making content like this. We really want to hear from you guys, so if you have ideas of questions that we can look into or content that we can make, then please drop a comment down below or get in touch with us directly. We want to say thank you as well to the speakers, to the donors, to the filmmakers, and also to you guys for making it happen. You know, it takes about 60 hours to create a film like this, and that's because we want it to be carefully researched. We want the talk to flow beautifully, and we want the filmmaking to be smooth. But that all takes time. And here at OCCA, our staff are funded by people who share our vision. So if you want to partner with the work that we are doing, please consider donating. I'll catch you next time.